What if the most dangerous thing an empath can do isn't arguing, isn't crying, but going completely silent? You've seen people leave before. You've seen breakups, fights, dramatic goodbyes. But this is different. Because when an empath quietly cuts you off, there's no warning, no final speech, no second chance. And the most unsettling part, they don't come back. Not after days, not after months, sometimes not ever. So what really happens inside an empath that makes them walk away so calmly yet so permanently? Why do they give so much for so long and then suddenly act like you never existed? In this video, we're going to uncover the hidden psychological shift, the silent breaking point, and the deep reason behind why they never return. And trust me, once you understand this, you'll never look at silence the same way again. If you've ever experienced this, or you're trying to make sense of someone who disappeared without a word, stay till the end, because the final truth might explain everything you've been questioning. There's a moment in every empath's life that almost no one sees coming, because it doesn't look like a breaking point at all. There's no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic exit. On the surface, everything may even seem normal. They still reply, they still listen, they still show up. But internally, something has shifted in a way that is quiet and final. This is what you could call the silent breaking point. The place where an empath stops feeling the need to fight for a connection that has been slowly draining them. It doesn't happen in one day, and it's never impulsive. In fact, it's the opposite. It's built over time through small disappointments, repeated patterns, and moments where they felt unseen, unheard, or emotionally alone while still being present for others. Empaths are naturally wired to understand, to forgive, and to give people the benefit of the doubt. They don't walk away easily, and they don't give up on people at the first sign of difficulty. If anything, they stay longer than they should. They try harder, love deeper, and carry more emotional weight than most people realize. So when they reach this silent breaking point, it's not because they didn't care enough. It's because they cared too much for too long without the same energy being returned. Every time they ignored their own needs to keep the peace, every time they chose patience over confrontation, and every time they hoped things would change, it added up. Not in a loud, explosive way, but in a quiet accumulation of emotional exhaustion. What makes this moment so powerful is that it happens internally, long before any physical distance appears. By the time an empath actually steps back or disappears, they've already processed the loss in their mind. They've already gone through the confusion, the disappointment, and the realization that this connection is no longer aligned with who they are. That's why, when they finally go silent, it feels sudden to others. People often think, everything was fine, what changed? But the truth is, everything had been changing for a long time. The empath was just the only one paying attention to it. There's also a deep sense of clarity that comes with this breaking point. It's not fueled by anger or revenge. It's calm, almost unsettlingly calm. The empath begins to see things as they truly are, without the emotional filters they once used to protect the connection. They stop making excuses for behavior that hurt them. They stop justifying inconsistency or lack of effort. And most importantly, they stop abandoning themselves to hold on to someone else. This clarity doesn't shout, It doesn't demand attention. It simply settles in, like a quiet understanding that something is no longer right, and hasn't been for a while. At this stage, the empath also realizes that explaining their feelings may not change anything. They've likely tried before in softer ways, in patient conversations, or in subtle signals that went unnoticed or unappreciated. So instead of repeating themselves, they choose silence. Not as a form of punishment, but as a form of self-respect. Because they understand that real change doesn't come from forcing someone to listen. It comes from recognizing when someone never truly did. What's important to understand is that this silence is not empty. It's full of decisions, realizations, and emotional closure that has already taken place. The empath is no longer waiting for things to get better. They are no longer holding on to potential or memories. They've reached a point where staying feels heavier than leaving, even if leaving means doing it quietly and without recognition. And once they cross that internal line, something fundamental changes. The attachment that once kept them holding on begins to dissolve, not out of coldness, but out of necessity. This is why the silent breaking point is so final. Because it's not based on a temporary emotion. It's the result of deep reflection and accumulated experience. By the time others notice the distance, the empath has already let go in ways that are not easily reversed. There's no dramatic closure because, for them, the closure has already happened. And in that quiet ending, there is a kind of strength that often goes misunderstood. The strength to walk away without noise, without blame, and without looking back. There's a quiet pattern in the life of an empath that often goes unnoticed, not just by others, but even by the empath themselves for a long time. It begins with a simple instinct to care, to understand, to be there when someone needs support. But over time, that instinct turns into something deeper, something heavier, where giving is no longer just a choice, it becomes a habit. Empaths don't measure how much they give in the beginning. They don't keep score, and they don't expect immediate returns. They give their time, their energy, their attention, and their emotional presence freely, believing that genuine connection naturally flows both ways. But what happens when it doesn't? What happens when the giving continues, but the receiving slowly disappears? This is where the real shift begins, though it's not obvious at first. The empath starts stretching themselves further than they should, emotionally and mentally, trying to maintain a connection that feels slightly unbalanced. They listen longer, they forgive quicker, they make more space for others than they do for themselves. Even when they feel tired, they push through it, telling themselves that this is what love, friendship, or loyalty is supposed to look like. And because they are so good at understanding others, they often excuse behavior that, deep down, doesn't feel right. They justify distance, inconsistency, or lack of effort, convincing themselves that maybe the other person is struggling. Maybe they just need more time. Maybe things will improve. But while they are busy holding everything together, something inside them begins to wear down. It doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, almost invisible, like a slow leak of energy that they don't notice until they feel completely drained. Every one-sided conversation, every moment of being emotionally available, without the same level of care in return, adds another layer of exhaustion. And the hardest part is, Empaths rarely speak about this openly. They don't want to seem demanding, they don't want to create conflict, and they certainly don't want to make someone feel guilty. So instead, they stay silent, carrying the weight quietly, hoping that their effort will eventually be seen and appreciated. There's also a deeper level to this that goes beyond just emotional effort. Empaths often invest themselves mentally and even spiritually into the people they care about. They think about them, worry about them, try to understand their behavior, and even absorb their emotions. When someone they care about is struggling, the empath doesn't just observe it, they feel it. And that kind of connection, while powerful, can also be incredibly draining when it's not balanced. It's like constantly pouring from your own cup into someone else's, without realizing that your own is slowly becoming empty. At some point, the empath begins to feel a subtle but persistent emptiness. Not because they have nothing to give, but because they've been giving in the wrong direction for too long. They start to notice that their energy isn't being restored, that their presence isn't being valued in the way they once believed. And this realization is not loud or dramatic. It's quiet, almost uncomfortable, because it forces them to confront a truth they've been avoiding, that they've been overextending themselves in a connection that isn't equally supportive. What makes this even more complex is that empaths don't stop caring instantly. Even when they feel drained, a part of them still wants to hold on, still hopes that things can change. But the more they give without receiving, the harder it becomes to ignore the imbalance. Eventually, they reach a point where continuing to give feels less like kindness and more like self-neglect. And that's when something begins to shift. They start pulling back, not out of anger, but out of necessity. They begin to protect their energy in ways they never did before. By the time others notice this change, it often feels confusing. People may wonder why the empath has become distant, less available, or less emotionally responsive. But what they don't see is the long period of over-giving that came before it. They don't see the countless moments where the empath chose others over themselves, or the internal exhaustion that built up over time. From the outside, it may look like the empath simply changed. But in reality, they've just reached the limit of what they can give without losing themselves completely. And when an empath reaches that limit, it's not just about taking a break. It's about recognizing that they cannot continue pouring into something that no longer pours back into them. Because once they understand that, they also understand something else, that giving too much for too long doesn't make a connection stronger. It slowly breaks the person who is giving. And that realization becomes the beginning of a very different kind of strength. One where they no longer sacrifice themselves to keep others comfortable. There comes a point in an empath's journey where something shifts in a way that cannot be undone. A moment often described as an awakening, though it doesn't feel dramatic or sudden. It feels quiet, almost like a slow clearing of fog. For a long time, empaths tend to see people not just for who they are, but for who they could be. They focus on potential, on the good hidden beneath flaws, on the possibility that with enough patience, understanding, and care, things will improve. This way of seeing the world is what makes them compassionate, but it also leaves them vulnerable to illusion. Because when you constantly focus on what someone could become, you can miss who they are showing themselves to be in the present. This awakening begins when that pattern becomes too painful to ignore. It often follows repeated experiences where the empath feels let down, confused, or emotionally drained despite giving their best. At first, they try to make sense of it in the same way they always have, by looking deeper, by analyzing behavior, by offering even more understanding. But eventually something stops them. A realization starts to form, subtle but persistent, that no amount of empathy can change someone who isn't willing to meet them halfway. And in that moment, the way they see people begins to change. They start noticing things they once overlooked. Small inconsistencies become clearer. Words that don't match actions stand out more sharply. Promises that were once given the benefit of the doubt now feel empty. It's not that these things weren't there before. It's that the empath is no longer filtering them through hope or emotional attachment. The illusion begins to break, and with it, the habit of making excuses for others. They no longer feel the need to justify behavior that hurts them, and they stop trying to translate mixed signals into something meaningful. One of the most powerful aspects of this awakening is the recognition of one-sided relationships. Empaths often invest deeply, offering time, energy, and emotional presence without hesitation. But in this phase, they begin to see the imbalance clearly. They notice who only reaches out when they need something, who listens without truly hearing, and who takes without ever giving back. This clarity can feel uncomfortable at first, because it challenges the image they once held of those connections. It forces them to accept that some relationships were never as mutual as they believed. Alongside this comes an awareness of manipulation, not always in an obvious or intentional form, but in subtle patterns of behavior. The empath begins to recognize when their kindness is being used, when their willingness to understand is taken as permission to overstep boundaries, and when emotional dynamics are quietly tilted in someone else's favor. What once felt confusing now starts to make sense. They see how certain patterns repeat, how certain words are used to avoid accountability, and how their own empathy was often the very thing that kept them stuck in those cycles. This shift in perception is not driven by bitterness or anger. It's driven by clarity. The empath is not becoming cold, they are becoming aware. They are learning to separate who someone is from who they hoped they would be. And that distinction changes everything. Because once you see reality clearly, it becomes much harder to stay in situations that don't align with your well-being. The emotional attachment that once kept them holding on begins to weaken, not because they stop caring, but because they start caring about themselves in a way they didn't before. There is also a quiet sense of grief that can come with this awakening. Letting go of illusions means letting go of certain expectations, certain hopes, and sometimes even certain people. It means accepting that not every connection is meant to grow, and not every person is willing or able to meet you at the level you offered them. But within that grief, there is also a sense of relief. The constant effort to maintain something that wasn't balanced begins to fade, and in its place comes a deeper sense of inner stability. As this awareness deepens, the empath becomes more selective with their energy. They no longer feel the need to prove their loyalty or their value through constant giving. They start to observe more, to listen differently, and to trust what they see rather than what they hope for. And perhaps most importantly, they begin to understand that real connection does not require constant effort to sustain. It flows naturally, with mutual respect and genuine presence. This awakening marks a turning point, because once an empath begins to see people clearly, they cannot return to the way they once perceived things. The patterns, the imbalances, the unspoken truths, they all become visible in a way that cannot be ignored. And while this clarity may change how they relate to others, it also brings them closer to themselves. Because in seeing others clearly, they finally begin to see their own worth without distortion, without compromise, and without illusion. One of the most misunderstood things about an empath is the way they leave. People often expect some kind of clear ending, a conversation, an explanation, or at least a final message that brings closure. But when an empath decides to walk away, it rarely looks like that. There's no announcement, no dramatic confrontation, no long explanation of what went wrong. Instead, there is silence. And to someone on the outside, that silence can feel confusing, even unfair. It raises questions like, why didn't they say anything? Or why did they just disappear? But the truth behind this quiet exit is much deeper than it appears. Empaths don't avoid communication because they lack the ability to express themselves. In fact, they are often very capable of putting their feelings into words. The real reason they choose silence is because, at some point before leaving, they already tried to be heard. They already expressed themselves, not always in loud or confrontational ways, but in subtle, patient, and emotionally honest ways. They may have pointed out what hurt them, hinted at what they needed, or tried to create space for understanding. But over time, they began to notice a pattern, that their words were not truly being received. They were heard, but not understood, acknowledged, but not valued. This realization changes how they approach the idea of closure. For many people, closure means sitting down, explaining everything, and hoping the other person finally understands. But for an empath, once they see that someone consistently fails to listen or take accountability, the idea of explaining again starts to feel pointless. Not because they don't care, but because they understand that words alone cannot change someone who has shown no real intention to change. And repeating the same conversation, hoping for a different outcome, only drains them further. There is also a quiet shift in how the empath values their own energy. In the past, they may have been willing to invest time and emotion into difficult conversations, trying to fix what was broken. But by the time they reach the point of leaving, they've already gone through that process internally. They've reflected, they've analyzed, and they've come to terms with what the relationship truly is. So when they finally step away, it's not a sudden decision that needs to be explained. It's the final step of a long internal journey that has already given them the clarity they need. Another important part of this silence is self-respect. Empaths begin to understand that constantly explaining themselves to someone who doesn't truly listen can feel like a form of self-betrayal. It puts them back into a position where they are trying to prove their feelings, justify their pain, or seek validation from someone who has repeatedly failed to provide it. And once they recognize this pattern, they no longer feel the need to participate in it. Silence, in this case, is not avoidance. It's a boundary. It's a way of saying, without words, that they are choosing not to engage in a cycle that no longer serves them. There's also an emotional truth that many people overlook. By the time an empath leaves, they are often already detached. The conversations that others expect at the end have already happened in the empath's mind many times. They've imagined what they would say, how the other person might respond, and whether anything would truly change. And after going through that process internally, they often come to the same conclusion, that nothing new would come from saying it out loud. So instead of reopening wounds or revisiting the same patterns, they choose to close the chapter quietly. This doesn't mean the empath feels nothing. On the contrary, their silence often carries a lot of emotion, disappointment, clarity, and even a sense of loss. But they no longer feel the need to express those emotions in a way that invites misunderstanding or dismissal. They've learned that not every feeling needs to be explained to be valid, and not every ending requires mutual agreement to be real. From the outside, this kind of exit can feel abrupt. It can leave the other person searching for answers, replaying moments, and trying to understand what went wrong. But what they don't see is that the empath didn't leave in a moment. They left over time. Every ignored feeling, every dismissed concern, and every unbalanced interaction slowly led to this point. The silence is not the beginning of the ending. It's the result of everything that came before it. In the end, an empath doesn't announce their exit because, for them, the most important realization has already been made, that their peace is worth more than being understood by someone who never truly listened. And once they reach that understanding, they no longer feel the need to explain why they're leaving. Their absence becomes the explanation, and their silence becomes the closure. There is a common misunderstanding when it comes to empaths, that no matter how far they go, they will eventually come back, that their silence is temporary, their distance is emotional, and their absence is just a phase. This belief often comes from how deeply they once cared, how consistently they showed up, and how much they were willing to forgive. People assume that someone who felt so much cannot simply stop. But what they fail to understand is that when an empath reaches the point of emotional detachment, it is not something sudden or reversible. It is the result of a long internal process, and once it happens, it is often final. Empaths do not detach easily. In fact, they hold on longer than most people would. They try to understand, to fix, to give more chances, even when it starts to cost them their own peace. Their attachment is not shallow. It is layered with time, effort, memories, and emotional investment. So when that attachment begins to break, it doesn't happen in one moment. It happens slowly, piece by piece, through repeated disappointment, unmet needs, and a growing sense that the connection is no longer safe or fulfilling. Each experience that goes unresolved creates a small distance inside them, a quiet shift away from what they once felt. At first, this shift is almost invisible. They may still act the same on the outside, still communicate, still show care, but internally something is changing. The emotional intensity they once felt begins to fade, not because they want it to, but because it can no longer survive in an environment where it is not supported. Over time, the empath starts to protect themselves in subtle ways. They expect less, they invest less, and they begin to withdraw emotionally, even before they physically step away. This is not a strategy. It is a natural response to emotional imbalance. What makes this detachment so powerful is that it reaches a point where it becomes complete. It is not partial, and it is not temporary. Once the empath fully disconnects, the emotional bond that once kept them tied to the person is no longer active. The same things that once triggered deep feelings, whether it was affection, concern, or even pain, no longer have the same effect. It's not that the empath has become cold or indifferent by nature. It's that their emotional system has recognized that continuing to feel in the same way would only lead to further harm, so it shuts down that connection entirely. This is why their absence feels so different when they leave after reaching this stage. It is calm, steady, and without hesitation. There is no back and forth, no moments of weakness where they return out of impulse, because by the time they detach, they have already processed the relationship on a deeper level. They've already faced the reality of what it is, and they've already let go internally. What others see as a sudden disappearance is actually the final step of a long emotional withdrawal that has already taken place. Another important aspect of this detachment is that it changes how the empath sees the person moving forward. The emotional lens through which they once viewed them is gone. The attachment that created a sense of closeness, understanding, or even hope no longer exists in the same way. Without that attachment, there is nothing pulling them back, nothing making them reconsider, and nothing creating the urge to reconnect. Even memories lose their emotional weight because they are no longer tied to an active feeling. People often try to interpret this detachment as a reaction, something caused by anger, pride, or a desire to make a point. But in reality, it is much quieter than that. It is not about proving anything or teaching a lesson. It is about self-preservation. The empath has reached a point where staying emotionally connected feels more damaging than letting go completely. And once that realization becomes clear, there is no reason to return to something that has already been understood. It's also important to recognize that this kind of detachment does not mean the empath never cared. In fact, it often means the opposite. It means they cared so deeply, for so long, that they reached the limits of what they could emotionally sustain. Their capacity to feel did not disappear. It was simply redirected away from a connection that could no longer hold it. And once that redirection happens, it is not easily reversed. In the end, emotional detachment for an empath is not a phase that passes with time. It is a permanent shift that reflects everything they have experienced and understood. It marks the point where they stop holding on, not because they have nothing left to feel, but because they have finally chosen not to feel it, in a place where it is not returned. And once they reach that point, their absence is no longer temporary. It becomes a quiet, lasting decision that does not need to be revisited. There is a moment in this entire dynamic that almost no one notices when it's happening, yet it changes everything. It's the moment the power quietly shifts. For a long time, the balance in the relationship tends to lean in one direction. The empath is the one giving more, understanding more, adjusting more. They are the one making the effort to keep things connected, to smooth over tension, to hold space even when it's not returned in the same way. And because they do this so naturally, it often goes unrecognized. Their presence becomes expected, their effort becomes normal, and over time, they are taken for granted without much thought. But what many people fail to realize is that this dynamic is being held together by the empath's energy. Their patience, their attention, their emotional availability, these are the invisible forces keeping the connection alive. So when the empath begins to withdraw, even subtly, the entire structure starts to change. At first, it's barely noticeable. Maybe they respond a little less. Maybe they stop initiating conversations. Maybe their tone becomes more neutral. It doesn't seem like much, but it's the beginning of a deeper shift. As this continues, the absence becomes more visible. The messages that once came easily are no longer there. The emotional support that was once constant starts to fade. The small efforts that held everything together quietly disappear. And this is when the other person begins to feel something is off. Not always immediately, and not always clearly, but there is a sense that something has changed. The comfort they once relied on is no longer present in the same way. This is where the power dynamic flips. Though it doesn't happen in a loud or obvious way, the person who once had consistent access to the empath's time and energy now begins to feel the lack of it. They may start reaching out more, paying closer attention, or even trying to reconnect in ways they didn't before. The roles begin to reverse. The one who was once certain of the empath's presence now feels uncertainty, while the empath, who once questioned everything, begins to feel clear and steady. What makes this shift so significant is that it often comes too late. By the time the other person starts to notice the absence and react to it, the empath has already gone through their internal process. They have already reflected, already detached, and already come to terms with the reality of the connection. So while the other person is just beginning to feel the loss, the empath has already moved beyond it emotionally. There is no urgency on their side, no need to fix what has already been understood. From the outside, this can feel confusing. It may seem like the empath has suddenly become distant or unresponsive without reason. But the truth is, the dynamic didn't change overnight. It changed gradually, through many unnoticed moments where the empath gave more than they received. The difference now is that those moments are no longer happening. The energy that once flowed freely has been pulled back, and without it, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. There is also a deeper realization that comes with this shift, especially for the empath. They begin to understand that their value was never in how much they could give, but in the presence they brought into the connection. And once that presence is no longer offered, the difference becomes clear. Not because they are trying to prove a point, but because their absence naturally reveals what their presence once provided. For the other person, this can create a sense of urgency or even regret. They may start to recognize the things they overlooked, the effort they didn't match, or the consistency they took for granted. But recognition alone does not always lead to change. And even when it does, it doesn't always arrive in time. Because by now, the empath is no longer in the same place emotionally. They are no longer waiting, no longer hoping for things to improve. and no longer tied to the outcome. This is why the power shift goes unnoticed at first. It doesn't come with an announcement or a clear turning point. It happens quietly, through the gradual withdrawal of energy and the steady rise of self-awareness. And by the time it becomes visible, it has already settled into something permanent. In the end, the shift is not about control or dominance. It's about balance being restored in a way that no longer depends on one person giving everything. The empath steps out of a role they carried for too long, and in doing so, they change the entire dynamic without needing to say a word. And while one side is just beginning to feel the weight of that change, the other has already learned how to live without it. In the end, the question that lingers the most is often the simplest one, yet the hardest to accept: why don't they come back? People are used to cycles, to breakups followed by reconnections, to distance that eventually turns into another chance. So when an empath leaves and never returns, it feels different. It feels final in a way that is difficult to understand, especially for those who believed the connection still had something left. But the truth is, an empath doesn't leave to create distance or to make a point. They leave because, at some point, they have fully understood something that they can no longer ignore. Empaths are not quick to give up on people. If anything, they stay longer than they should, holding on to the belief that things can improve, that understanding can fix what feels broken, and that patience will eventually be met with effort. They don't walk away at the first sign of difficulty, and they don't leave without trying. In fact, by the time they do leave, they have already given more chances than most would. They have already invested time, energy, and emotional depth into making the connection work. So when they finally step away, it is not out of impulse. It is the result of reaching a conclusion that feels clear and irreversible. That conclusion is not always loud or dramatic. It's quiet, steady, and deeply personal. It comes from recognizing patterns that haven't changed, from accepting realities they once tried to avoid, and from understanding that no matter how much they give, the dynamic will remain the same. And once an empath truly understands this, something inside them shifts permanently. They stop looking at the connection through hope and start seeing it through truth. And truth, once fully seen, is not something they can unsee. This is why they don't come back. Not because they don't feel anything, and not because they are trying to prove strength or independence. They don't return because going back would mean ignoring everything they have learned. It would mean stepping back into a pattern they have already outgrown, and pretending that the awareness they gained never happened. For an empath, that doesn't feel like love or loyalty. It feels like self-betrayal. It feels like choosing discomfort over peace and confusion over clarity. There is also a deeper sense of closure that empaths reach on their own. They don't always need a final conversation or a mutual agreement to move on. Their closure comes from understanding, from connecting the dots, and from accepting what the relationship truly was. By the time they leave, they have already processed the emotions that others are just beginning to feel. They have already asked the questions, already searched for answers, and already made peace with what they found. So when they walk away, they are not waiting for something to bring them back. They have already closed that chapter within themselves. For those on the outside, this can be difficult to accept. There may be a belief that with time, things can be fixed, that distance will create clarity, or that the empath will eventually soften and return. But what's often misunderstood is that time, for the empath, did not begin when they left. It began long before that, during all the moments they stayed and tried to make things work. The distance that others experience after the ending is the same distance the empath has already lived through internally. Another important truth is that when an empath outgrows a connection, they don't just move away from a person. They move into a different version of themselves. They become more aware, more grounded, and more protective of their energy. The standards they once lowered, they now hold firmly. The things they once tolerated, they now recognize immediately. And with this growth, going back is no longer just about reconnecting with someone. It's about stepping back into a version of themselves they have already left behind. This is what makes their absence feel so permanent. It's not based on emotion alone, it's based on transformation. The empath is no longer the same person who once stayed, who once hoped, and who once tried to fix everything. They have changed in a way that no longer aligns with the old dynamic. And because of that, returning is not just unlikely, it feels impossible in a deeper sense. In the end, an empath doesn't leave to teach someone a lesson or to create regret. They leave because they have learned their own. They have learned where their limits are, what they deserve, and what they can no longer accept. And once that lesson becomes clear, there is nothing left pulling them back. Their silence is not a pause, their absence is not a test, and their distance is not temporary. It is a decision rooted in understanding, and once that understanding is reached, they don't return, because they no longer belong to what they had to walk away from.